In 1921, in the very heart of New York City, the first stone was laid for a building that, in time, would become a symbol not just of wealth and influence, but of something far older and far more unsettling. On the official photographs of the opening ceremony for the Trump Dominion building, a single figure draws the eye, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, his posture rigid, his expression fixed and unreadable. His face shows no warmth, no tension, no hint of uncertainty. This was Edward Trump, a businessman of German origin who, according to the public record, had arrived in the United States only a year before the outbreak of the First World War. Newspapers at the time painted the Trump family's story as a model immigrant success. Years of relentless labor, gradual accumulation of wealth, and calculated investments in real estate. Yet one detail never fit. No photographs of Edward Trump prior to 1921 have ever been found. No documents of his supposed earlier life in America have surfaced. No addresses, no business licenses, no mention in shipping manifests. It is as if he simply appeared in New York, already in possession of millions of dollars and a network of contacts powerful enough to secure him prime land in Manhattan. The Dominion building was presented to the public as the headquarters of the East Coast Road Improvement Association, a little-known organization whose stated mission was to promote the development of transportation infrastructure. The reality, however, was far stranger. Beneath the marble floors and gilded lobbies, in the echoing cellars that stretched under the streets, private gatherings took place. Always at night, always behind locked doors, always guarded by men who spoke to no one. A surviving statement from a chance observer, archived in a neglected corner of the Municipal Records Office, offers one of the only eyewitness accounts of such an evening. All the windows of the building had been sealed with heavy curtains, so no light could escape. I saw men wearing black gloves carry long, narrow crates into the main hall. A strange odor hung in the air, something between heated metal and church incense. Later, when the doors opened again, I noticed something peculiar. Fewer people left the building than had gone inside. Over the next 4 years, Edward Trump acquired entire city blocks. Yet, curiously, he rarely rebuilt or renovated the structures he purchased. Instead, he seemed far more interested in what lay beneath them. Basements of century-old townhouses, sealed-off sublevels of derelict warehouses, forgotten storage vaults from the colonial era. Time and again, his acquisitions revealed buried tunnels and abandoned chambers. Some connected to points marked on antique maps of New York, places that no longer existed above ground. By 1925, whispers began to circulate in the city's upper circles. Trump, they said, was linked to a clandestine order known as the Circle of the Eastern Gate, a brotherhood whose lineage traced back deep into the shadows of European history. Their emblem was simple yet unsettling, a triangle inscribed within a perfect circle, accompanied by 3 Latin words: ingressum, custodium, exodus, entrance, guardianship, exit. What they guarded, no one could say for certain. Some spoke of artifacts recovered from old cathedrals in the German states, others of relics brought across the Atlantic centuries earlier and hidden beneath the city's foundations. But those few who claimed to have glimpsed the subterranean halls of the Dominion building spoke of something entirely different. The walls, they said, were etched from floor to ceiling with symbols that resembled no known alphabet, lines and spirals that seemed to shift in the corner of one's vision, forms that suggested both writing and architecture, as if the very language had been designed to be built, not read. One witness claimed the markings were not carved into the stone, but pressed from within, as though the building itself had been formed around them. No one ever photographed these walls. No sketch survives. And yet the rumors persisted, whispered from one decade to the next, that the Dominion building's true purpose had nothing to do with roads or offices, and everything to do with what waited in the dark beneath New York's streets. In the spring of 1932, only a few weeks after the funeral of Edward Trump, a crew of laborers descended into the basement of the Trump Dominion building. Their instructions were straightforward: dismantle the old archival shelving, reinforce the foundation, and prepare the lower floors for minor renovation. But the job changed the moment one of them tapped a wall with his hammer and heard something hollow. Behind a sheet of poured concrete, old, rough, and clearly added after the building's original construction, was a sealed chamber. The opening was narrow, forcing the men to squeeze through into a space that felt noticeably colder than the rest of the basement. The room was small, windowless, and bare. The only light came from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, its cord vanishing into a cable that did not appear to connect to any of the city's electrical grids. No switch, no fuse box, just a slow, constant glow. In the center of the floor stood a massive wooden chest, dark with age. It was sealed with a mechanical lock, no keyhole, no combination numbers, only a single rotating disc engraved with symbols unlike any alphabet the men recognized. They weren't Latin, they weren't Cyrillic. They seemed almost pictorial, yet carried a strange internal symmetry. The foreman radioed upstairs for instructions, but the reply never came. Instead of waiting, the crew set to work with crowbars, forcing the lock. The wood resisted more than it should have, fibers snapping reluctantly, as if they had been grown to hold something in, not just to enclose it. When the lid finally gave way, the air in the room shifted. A sharp, layered smell rushed out, a mixture of damp earth, old ash, and something harder to name, something metallic but burned. Inside was an object, no larger than a suitcase, yet unlike anything the workers had ever seen. It looked like a block of black resin, but its geometry betrayed its artificial nature. Edges too exact, surfaces unnaturally smooth. Even in the warmth of the basement, it was cold to the touch. Its surface reflected no light, swallowing it instead. The find was removed under orders from above and taken not to a city department, but to a private laboratory long known to have discreet ties with the Trump family. The official records of any testing vanish here. Nothing in the municipal archives, no reference in the newspapers. But a carbon copy of a letter survives in the personal papers of a city clerk, dated June 1932. It reads, "Material, unknown origin. Not subject to cutting, melting, or deformation. When exposed to light at a precise wavelength, surface reveals a set of lines resembling a coastal outline, not of any current map." 3 days later, the man who had written that letter vanished. He left behind no personal effects, no sign of struggle, just an office with the blinds drawn and a cold cup of coffee on his desk. That same day, the chamber in the basement of the Dominion building was filled with concrete. The order was carried out immediately, and the explanation given was risk of structural collapse. All access was sealed, and the plans for that part of the building were quietly redrawn to erase its existence. Publicly, the Trump family denied that anything unusual had been found. Yet, among the city's storage invoices from that year, there remains one curious line item: a wooden crate, marked as defective industrial sample, removed from the Dominion building and transferred to an undisclosed location. The signature on the receipt is unmistakable: Frederick Trump, Edward's son, then just beginning to take the reins of the family's growing empire. From that point onward, the Trumps were no longer spoken of simply as a wealthy dynasty. Whispers began to call them keepers, custodians of something that was never meant to be discovered, something that could not be destroyed, and something that no outsider should ever be allowed to possess. In the autumn of 1937, the industrial quarter of Brooklyn lit up in a way it had not in decades. A fire broke out in warehouse number 12, a sprawling, brick-walled structure owned by Trump Storage and Logistics. City papers would later call it the strangest blaze of the decade, not for its destruction, but for the way it behaved. The warehouse stood near the waterfront, in a district of cranes, cobblestones, and rail spurs. It was a gray, wet afternoon, rain falling in steady sheets. Under normal circumstances, that rain should have slowed any fire before it could take hold. Instead, the flames inside number 12 erupted with a sudden, violent bloom, as if they had been waiting. Within minutes, smoke poured from every upper window. Fire crews arrived quickly and began forcing entry. According to their official statements, the building contained rolls of fabric, stacked lumber, and archived records. Nothing unusual for a company whose public business was storage and freight. But the first men through the side entrance saw something else. Neat rows of metal containers, each waist-high, each stenciled with a series of unfamiliar symbols. The markings were not numbers, not letters, at least not from any alphabet recognized by the men on scene. But they matched something seen before. The same strange characters that had been engraved on the lock of the wooden chest discovered in the basement of the Trump Dominion building 5 years earlier. And the fire itself did not behave like fire should. Witnesses described it as moving deliberately, ignoring the push of the wind, advancing in long, perfect lines, as though tracing some invisible pattern across the warehouse floor. Entire piles of timber ignited at once, while other areas, mere feet away, remained untouched. Several firefighters, in later private conversations, claimed they heard a sound under the roar of the flames, a deep, resonant hum, slow and rhythmic, almost like chanting. None of these details made it into the official incident report. The captain on duty that day would later tell his son, "We were told to forget what we heard." When the blaze was finally beaten back, little remained of the structure but its charred steel skeleton. And yet, among the wreckage, some of the metal containers stood pristine. No scorch marks, no warping from the heat. When the men touched them, their walls felt cold. Inside, each box held a single object, wrapped in thick, pale cloth. The fabric had a faint sheen, almost waxy to the touch, and though it had been surrounded by intense fire, it showed no signs of burning or melting. It seemed to repel heat entirely. The city never cataloged these items. The paperwork trail ends abruptly with a terse note in the fire department's file. Contents transferred for disposal under private order. That order came directly from Frederick Trump. No description of the objects, no mention of where they were sent. Years later, however, a small piece of that same cloth surfaced in the private collection of a Manhattan antiquarian. He claimed to have bought it from a retired dock worker who had been paid to keep quiet after the fire. Laboratory analysis revealed the material was composed of roughly 70% organic matter, but of a kind that did not match any known plant or animal tissue. The rest was an unidentifiable compound that resisted both chemical and thermal breakdown. After the fire, the Trump family altered their operations. Every property they owned acquired new layers of security: private guards, reinforced access points, cameras in the stairwells. The basement of the Trump Dominion building was sealed again, this time behind a heavy steel grille secured with 7 separate locks. Among New York's business elite, the whispers began to shift. The Trumps were no longer spoken of merely as real estate magnates. The language changed: custodians, keepers, carriers. It was said they moved and protected objects whose origins lay far beyond any trade ledger or shipping manifest. Objects that, if lost or exposed, might draw the wrong kind of attention not from rival companies, but from things no one wanted to meet. In 1944, as battles raged across Europe and the Pacific, the United States Department of Defense signed an unusual wartime contract with the Trump family. On paper, it was routine: filed under logistical support for strategic material transport. But documents declassified decades later revealed glaring irregularities. The contract contained no clear descriptions of the cargo, no specific routes, no recorded tonnage or delivery schedules. Instead, it included a clause, buried halfway through the text, that prohibited any mention of the project in official reports, in newspapers, or even in private correspondence. Violation would bring criminal prosecution under wartime statutes. What little is known suggests that under this arrangement, Trump Storage and Logistics acquired several aging cargo ships and exclusive access to designated rail spurs connecting to isolated warehouses in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico. One of those warehouses sat just a few miles from the Roswell Army Airfield. Yes, that Roswell, the name that would ignite global speculation only 3 years later. A former railroad employee, who decades later agreed to speak anonymously, recalled that during night runs to these warehouses, he saw flatbed cars loaded with long, lead-sealed crates, each roughly the size and shape of a coffin. The cars would arrive under full military guard. Soldiers, armed and silent, stood in a ring around the unloading area. The crates bore a now familiar marking, the same line of strange symbols stenciled on the fireproof containers salvaged from the Brooklyn warehouse fire of 1937. More troubling still was what happened after the war. When the contract quietly ended, every ship used in the operation was dismantled and scrapped. The rail spurs were pulled up and sold for scrap metal. The warehouses, those that hadn't been outright demolished, were filled in with concrete, leaving only flat, empty pads in the weeds. Locals whispered that the ground in those places was wrong. Geiger counter hobbyists claimed the soil produced faint but measurable radiation. Others said compasses misbehaved there, as though an invisible field still lingered under the concrete. Then, in 1946, Frederick Trump abruptly stepped down as head of the company and withdrew from public life. The official explanation: health problems. The unofficial one: an irreconcilable dispute with federal agents over hazardous recoveries the Trumps had allegedly tried to keep for themselves. Whatever the truth, the family moved swiftly to erase this chapter from its history. There were no public records of the shipments, no surviving manifests, no invoices. The Navy's archive listed the Trump cargo vessels simply as expended assets. And yet, within the closed, whispered circles of New York's financial elite, a new rumor began to take root. The story went that the Trumps had struck a private bargain with the government. In exchange for their cooperation and silence, they were allowed to retain part of the shipment. If true, it would mean the family was not merely storing unknown materials. They were keeping them in the same kind of sealed, symbol-marked containers that had appeared again and again over the decades, always in places touched by secrecy, destruction, or disappearance. The question that has never been answered, not in official records, not in any surviving memoir, is simple. What was in those crates? And why was someone willing to risk everything to make sure at least a portion of it stayed in the hands of the Trump family? In the summer of 1953, during renovations on one of the older warehouses owned by Trump Storage and Logistics on Manhattan's West Side, a construction crew uncovered something that should not have been there. While tearing out a section of the north wall, they struck concrete that didn't match the building's original blueprints. It was thicker, far thicker, than anything else in the structure, nearly half a meter deep. The foreman assumed it was part of an old reinforcement pour, a wartime precaution. But when their hammers rang against it, the sound was wrong, muted, heavy, as if striking against a hollow core. Behind that wall was a windowless room, no larger than 3 meters square. No ventilation shafts, no wiring, no signs it had ever been connected to the rest of the building. Its single door had been sealed from the inside, the seams fused over in concrete so dense it had to be shattered piece by piece. When they finally broke through, The air that escaped was thick with dry, ancient dust, and something else. An almost imperceptible metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden crate, its lid locked down by dozens of rusted bolts. The edges had been sealed with a hard, black resin, still intact after decades. On one side, burned deep into the grain, was a set of symbols, familiar now to historians of the Trump archives, identical to those seen on the wartime containers from the Brooklyn warehouse fire in 1937. But here, the markings weren't paint. They had been scorched into the wood, as though by a branding iron, impossible to remove without destroying the crate itself. When the bolts were finally worked loose, the men inside found a cylindrical metal vessel just over a meter in length. It was completely sealed, with no visible seams or latches. Beneath its dust-covered surface were irregular patches of corrosion, yet not the kind caused by water or salt. This looked as though the metal had been eaten away by something unknown, some chemical process that should not exist outside a laboratory, if at all. The laborers had no idea what they'd found. They reported it to their foreman, who passed it up to the site manager. 2 hours later, the warehouse was surrounded, not by police or uniformed soldiers, but by men in civilian clothes, carrying identification from an agency none of the workers had heard of before. The State Committee for Security. The crew was ordered out immediately. Each man signed a non-disclosure agreement under threat of prosecution, then was escorted off the premises. None of them ever worked for the company again. From that point, the trail of the container goes dark. There is no mention of it in the 1953 renovation reports, no photographs, no inventory records. But a few weeks later, multiple witnesses claimed they saw Frederick Trump himself standing outside the warehouse with 2 men in long, dark coats. One swore under oath that he saw the cylindrical object wrapped in a canvas shroud, being loaded into an unmarked armored truck. What happened next is speculation. Some believe the container was transported to one of the family's off-record storage sites in Pennsylvania or New Mexico. Others think it never left New York, but was hidden in one of the company's private vaults beneath the city. What is documented is this. Beginning in late 1953, the Trump family's influence in New York's financial circles began to climb sharply. They invested in properties that made no immediate commercial sense: empty lots, derelict brownstones, half-finished office towers, but which, years later, became critical pieces in the city's infrastructure. They seemed to be working to a long-term plan that no outsider could see. As for the container, no one can say what it held. The only surviving rumor, whispered years later by a former company accountant, was that it wasn't opened until several years after it was found. And when it was, it supposedly became the start of a private family legend, something passed down only to the next generation. The name given to it, according to that same source, was simple: the inheritance that cannot be sold. 1961. Donald Trump was only 15 years old, still more boy than man, when he first began to understand the long, cold shadow cast over his family. It was a summer afternoon, thick with the hum of Manhattan heat, when he crept up into the dusty attic of one of his father's older properties, a brick-faced townhouse the family rarely visited. The air smelled of mothballs and stale wood. Pushed into a far corner, beneath a faded tarpaulin, was a massive oak chest. The lock was rusted through, but the heavy iron crossbar still held the lid shut. It took Donald nearly an hour with a crowbar to pry them loose. Inside was not the clutter of forgotten furniture or clothes he expected, but a neatly stacked archive, a bundle of yellowed documents, a cracked leather notebook, and several black and white photographs. One photo showed a small, windowless cement room, the kind described in hushed family conversations, but never acknowledged in public. Another depicted a metal cylinder, the same proportions as the wartime containers, standing in the center of a richly furnished office. Around it, several men in dark suits stood with their hands behind their backs, their faces turned away from the camera. The notebook was the real prize. Its leather cover was split from age, the paper inside brittle to the touch, and every page carried a faint scent of scorched metal, as though it had been stored near something that had burned without flame. On the first page, written in Frederick Trump's precise hand, was a single line: "Keep it until they come, and do not open it if you want the world to remain as it is." From there, the writing grew stranger. Frederick described an encounter in the late 1920s with a man calling himself Dr. Karl Werner. Werner claimed to have returned from a secret Arctic expedition with an object not made by human hands. He was looking for someone wealthy, well-connected, and sufficiently cold-blooded to hide it away. Frederick had agreed, not realizing the decision would haunt the family for decades. The notebook contained what appeared to be a detailed description of the container's contents, but just as the account reached specifics, the page had been torn out. Only fragments of phrases remained. A voice that does not sound. Movement inside stillness. A light you cannot look at. Further entries leapt ahead to 1953, the year the sealed basement room had been discovered. Frederick wrote that the object had begun, affecting those in its proximity, causing vivid nightmares and lapses in memory. 3 workers involved in moving the container soon disappeared. Officially, they were let go and left the city, but neighbors swore none of them ever came home. Near the middle of the notebook, sketches began to replace sentences, symbols, sigils, geometric diagrams. One stood out, a circle divided into 4 equal quadrants, each containing a different figure: a human, an animal, a bird, and something shapeless. Beneath it, Frederick had scrawled, 4 keepers, 1 key. Donald remembered seeing, more than once, men in long dark coats visiting the house after the warehouse renovation in '53. He had overheard fragments of their conversations, something about an obligation carried in the bloodline. The final entry was dated 1959. "They say it is time to prepare the next one. They say the boy must know where not to look. I told them he is still a child. They said, he is already on their list." The attic dust seemed heavier as Donald closed the notebook. From that day forward, he became quietly obsessed with the container. He pressed his father for details, where it was, who had it. But Frederick always answered vaguely, deflecting questions or changing the subject. Then, according to one distant relative, Donald learned the truth. The container was no longer in New York. It had been moved to an undisclosed location, known to only 3 people in the country. It was in that moment, the relative said, that Donald's path diverged from the public story of the Trump family. Real estate and business were the visible face. Beneath it ran the other line, the hidden inheritance, the role of keeper for something that might not belong to this world at all. 1973. Donald Trump was 27, already maneuvering through New York's volatile real estate market with a mix of ambition and calculated charm. But behind the negotiations and construction sites, the quiet obsession that had haunted him since his teenage years refused to fade. For more than a decade, he had searched for a living thread connecting him to the events of 1953, the year of the sealed room, the container, and his father's guarded warnings. The trail was cold until he found a name in the back of Frederick Trump's notebook, Harold Mace. The notes were sparse. Third handler, survived, written in Frederick's hand. But they stood out. Of the 3 men who had physically moved the container in 1953, 2 had vanished within months. Mace was the only one who, on paper, had lived on. Yet after 1955, there was no trace of him in any public record. No tax filings, no address, nothing but silence. Donald's search took months of quiet inquiries, old contacts, and discreet payments to private investigators. Eventually, the pieces formed a location: a decaying farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, miles from the nearest town, where electricity had long since been cut. Locals called Mace that strange one who burns things in the yard at night. They claimed they had seen him hauling out warped bits of metal and splintered wood, piling them high and setting them alight until sparks hissed into the dark. Donald drove there himself. The house leaned slightly to one side, its porch sagging under the weight of years. To the left of the front steps lay a twisted heap of scrap metal, shattered frames, corroded hinges, warped panels that could have once been the sides of shipping crates. Some pieces looked eerily similar to the wartime containers Donald had seen in photographs, but melted and bent as if from heat no furnace could produce. Inside, the air was thick with the tang of rust and smoke. Every surface wore a fur of dust. The walls were scrawled with charcoal drawings, circles intersecting at impossible angles, jagged lines, distorted human figures with blurred, indistinct faces. Mace was gaunt, his eyes sunken yet piercing. His voice was dry as paper. When Donald asked about the container, he gave only one answer, repeated twice. Nothing happened. There was nothing. It's all a story. But Donald noticed something Mace did not seem aware of, or perhaps was guarding. As he spoke, the old man's hand rested on a tarnished medallion hanging from his neck. When Mace stepped outside to fetch water from a rain barrel, Donald examined it more closely. The design was unmistakable, a circle divided into 4 equal quadrants, each holding a distinct symbol, the same 4 keepers emblem sketched in Frederick's notebook. That evening, as Donald prepared to leave, Mace paused in the doorway. His face was in shadow, but his voice had a strange weight to it, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere far behind his eyes. You think it belonged to them? No, they belong to it. And if you learn what's inside, your blood becomes the key. Without another word, he stepped back into the darkened hall and disappeared from sight. Donald waited, unsure if Mace would return, then turned and walked into the cool Pennsylvania night. He drove away with more questions than answers, but one thing had crystallized in his mind. The link between the container and the Trump family was not coincidence. It was inheritance, deliberate, chosen, perhaps generations deep. Back in New York, Donald began combing through archives and private collections, looking for the medallion's emblem. His search eventually led to a grainy photograph dated 1922, his grandfather, standing beside the container itself. In his hands, unmistakably, was the very same medallion Harold Mace had worn. It was then that Donald understood. Whatever the container was, it had been in his family's possession for far longer than he had been told. And the 4 keepers were not just symbols, they were roles. One of them, whether he liked it or not, might one day be his. By the end of 1974, Donald Trump had gathered enough fragments of the story to chart a route. Old entries from Navy warehouse logs, scraps of police reports, and notes from Frederick's tattered journal all pointed to one location, a wooded tract northwest of Pittsburgh. On official maps, the area was marked only as private property of a company dissolved in 1949. Donald went there in winter, when the ground lay hidden under a crust of snow, and the air was thick and dry. The road ended nearly a kilometer before the coordinates he had marked. From there, it was only trees, the crunch of ice underfoot, and his breath in the cold air. Through the skeletal branches, he could see them. Concrete walls streaked with moss, the remains of old storage buildings. Inside one of the half-collapsed hangars, he found a hatch set into the floor. The metal lid was orange with rust, but the lock on it looked disturbingly new. He forced it open, and a wave of stench rolled up from below, a nauseating blend of rot and cold iron. The ladder dropped into a narrow underground corridor. The cement walls were studded with handprints, as if pressed into the surface decades ago before the concrete had set. But the impressions were wrong. Too long, the fingers jointed in ways human hands were not. At the corridor's end, it waited. The container. Black, its recessed panels swallowing the beam of his flashlight, and in the center, the same symbol. But here, the mark seemed cut deeper than in the photograph from 1922, as if someone had kept carving at it over the years, pushing it further into the metal. Donald felt the hum, not a sound exactly, but a vibration running through his bones, emanating from the container's frame. Each step closer was harder than the last, the air seeming to grow denser around him. He reached out toward the surface and noticed fresh scratches along one of the panels, the marks sharp and clean, as though someone had tried to pry it open not long ago. On the floor beside it lay something wrapped in a sheet of old canvas. Peeling back the fabric, Donald uncovered a medallion, identical to the one Harold Mace had worn. Inside its cover, an inscription in a language he could not read was cut deep into the metal. That was when he knew he wasn't alone. From somewhere in the darkness, a faint tapping began. Slow, steady. Not footsteps. Not echo. It was coming from inside the container, each knock deliberate, as if something, or someone, was marking time. Donald didn't open it. He walked out. But now he understood. Whatever the container was, it was still active. And judging by the scratches and the sound, something inside was trying to get out. Early 1975. Donald Trump had learned by now that charging headfirst into the mystery was dangerous. The failed conversation with Harold Mace still lingered in his mind, along with the image of the medallion and the words, "Your blood becomes the key." This time, he would proceed with caution. Through quiet inquiries in the construction industry and a few favors owed, Donald made contact with two men whose credentials reached into the sealed corridors of the defense sector. Howard Langley, a physicist with classified materials research experience, and Joseph Carpenter, a systems engineer who had once worked on experimental containment projects for the Navy. They agreed to meet only under strict conditions: no written records, no photographs, and no mention of names in any official context. They wanted nothing traceable, not even the location. The rendezvous took place at a privately leased hangar northwest of Pittsburgh. It was an unassuming building from the outside, its corrugated walls blending into the winter landscape. But beneath it, hidden behind a locked freight elevator and a corridor of reinforced concrete, was the room Donald had arranged for them to see. Even before reaching the container, both men seemed unsettled. Langley's breathing grew heavier, as though the air itself resisted him. Carpenter kept glancing over his shoulder, frowning into empty space, muttering that someone's right there. They began their inspection. Langley knelt with a portable spectrometer, adjusting its narrow scanning arm toward the surface of the container. The device powered on, then instantly failed. The screen fractured from the inside with a spiderweb crack, and a thin frost bloomed along the interior components, even though the underground air was mild. Carpenter approached with a magnetic thickness gauge, intending to test the density of the metal. As soon as the sensor made contact, it wrenched itself from his grip and slammed into the panel with a force far beyond its weight. He struggled to pry it off. The magnet held, as though the container had swallowed it. Minutes passed, and then, without any signal or prompt, their behavior shifted. Langley froze mid-step, staring at a point in the air several feet above the container. His lips moved, forming syllables that didn't belong to any language Donald knew. Rolling consonants, almost melodic, almost mechanical. Carpenter, without a word, placed his bare hand directly on the center symbol etched into the container's surface. His posture slackened, his breathing slowed, and for a moment, he looked more like a man listening than touching. That's when the lights died. Donald's flashlight beam cut through the sudden black, jittering as his pulse quickened. The container was glowing, not brightly, but with a muted, rhythmic pulse. And that pulse, it matched something he'd heard before, a faint, steady tapping that seemed to come from deep within the metal. The light returned in less than a second. Langley and Carpenter were gone, completely gone. No footsteps leading out, no sound of movement, no lingering breath in the cold air. Only their tools remained, scattered where they'd been working, and two empty protective suits lying collapsed on the floor, their gloves turned upward as if they'd been set down gently. Donald's eyes locked on the container. It hadn't moved. But something was different. New marks scored its surface, deep scratches radiating outward from the central symbol, reaching toward the edges in jagged lines. They hadn't been there before. Later, Donald would replay the scene in his mind over and over. He would ask himself whether Langley and Carpenter had touched something invisible, stepped into some unseen space, or whether the container itself had taken them. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The inheritance was no longer a dormant legacy. It was active, and it had just claimed two more names. Spring, 1975. The disappearance of Langley and Carpenter changed something in Donald. Up until that night, he had thought of the container as an enigma, a puzzle that might yield to cleverness, resources, and the right kind of force. Now he understood it for what it was, a living problem, one that could not be taken apart like a piece of real estate. For weeks, he tried to bury himself in business, meetings, contracts, new properties. On the surface, his life moved forward. But the container pulled at the back of his mind like a nail under the skin. Every news headline about a missing person, every whispered report of strange lights over rural towns, every mention of distant thunder with no storm. It all felt connected to the thing buried under concrete in northwestern Pennsylvania. Then came the letter. No postage. No return address. No postmark. The envelope had simply appeared, slipped under his office door while he was away at lunch. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for one thing. The same carved symbol from the container's face, printed in dark ink, and below it, 6 words. Soon, you will be the keeper. That evening, Donald returned to his office late. The room was empty, except for the object lying squarely in the center of his desk. The medallion. The same one Harold Mace had worn when he muttered his cryptic warning. The same medallion Donald had never been able to find again. It was cold. Colder than the metal should have been in the warm air of the office. When he turned it over, he saw a fresh engraving on the inner face. 1921, the date his family's involvement had begun, and beside it, an empty space, deliberately left for the next date. It didn't take long for him to understand the message. The chain of keepers was still intact. He was next, not by choice, but by the design of something older and more deliberate than his will. Donald decided then, the container had to be destroyed. The attempts came quickly. Construction equipment, industrial drills, even controlled demolition charges. Nothing worked. The metal would not cut, bend, or crack. And worse, the machinery itself seemed to revolt in the container's presence. Engines stalled, hydraulic systems locked, control panels burned out with the smell of scorched copper. One night, driving alone toward the site, Donald noticed headlights behind him in the rearview mirror, a black sedan running without its lights. It followed him for 20 miles along the empty back roads. When he reached the hangar and stepped out of his car, the road behind him was empty. No sound. No tail lights fading in the dark. Just gone. Inside the underground corridor, the container was different. The panels did not align perfectly anymore. The seam along the upper edge was open, no more than the width of a fingernail, but open. From that gap came a slow, cold draft. And underneath it, almost masked by the air's chill, came something else. Breathing. Low. Steady. Rhythmic. Donald locked the hatch. Then he barricaded the entrance with stacked concrete blocks until the corridor looked like the wall of a tomb. And still, as he drove away, he knew it was not gone, only waiting. The last image tied to this period comes from a photograph dated 1981. Taken somewhere in the same region, it shows a young man in a tailored business suit standing before a bricked-over doorway. The face is blurred, lost in the overexposed grain of the print. In his hand is the medallion. The symbol is unmistakable. Written on the back of the photograph in neat block letters. The inheritance is not for sale. It chooses for itself.